You are listening to the Climate Fairplay podcast, a place where we discuss global climate and environmental news, science, and politics. My name is Cody Sanford. I'm a trained ecologist and the host of this podcast. This is the first interview for the Climate Fairplay, and I need to be blunt as to why we're having this conversation. I'm increasingly concerned about the current state of our global water systems. Recent flooding disasters have highlighted not only how climate change will cause a scarcity of water, but also create the conditions to cause severe damage. The flooding in North Carolina killed 130 people, and it's estimated to cost $53 billion in damages. In the country of Libya, flooding led to the collapse of 2 dams, causing over 11,000 deaths. In Valencia, Spain, a storm brought a year's worth of rain in just 8 hours to the region. At least 217 lives have been lost, and the full damage is still being understood as I'm recording this. Scientists have clearly linked these disasters to climate change. Warmer air and oceans intensify storms and the potential damage they can cause. Scientific reports on global water resources have recently been published, and the results are troubling. The global water cycle is under unprecedented threat, according to the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. The report lists climate change, destructive land use, and mismanagement as the driving forces. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and this led to prolonged drought conditions. 2023 was particularly hard on Earth's glaciers. Last year, glaciers lost the most volume in a single year than at any point in the past 5 decades. Over 600 gigatons of water were released. Currently, 3.6 billion people face inadequate access to water for at least 1 month per year. This number is expected to rise to over 5 billion people by 2050. This will also affect food security. Global cereal production, a critical food resource, will fall by as much as 23% if the current trends continue. Water is an early indicator of environmental shifts and is often called the canary in the coal mine of climate change. This reality is evident in historically low levels across major waterways like the Amazon and Colorado rivers. The threat of prolonged droughts putting a further strain on water resources is a global issue. Every continent faces the threat of longer dry periods disrupting our ecosystems, agriculture, and access to clean water. Amid these challenges, understanding the complexities of our water system is essential. To help us better understand the complex relationship between water, climate change, and our current global situation, I've invited a friend and esteemed water scientist and hydrologic researcher to provide insights into what these reports mean for the water cycle. Joining for our first interview on the Climate Fairplay podcast is Daniel Dominguez. Daniel is currently completing his PhD at Colorado State University, focusing on using machine learning and deep algorithmic techniques to enhance water quality data. Daniel is a Marshall Scholar, a highly competitive scholarship that covers the cost of 2 master's degrees in the United Kingdom, and a United States Marine veteran. Daniel brings a wealth of experience to our discussion. Daniel holds a bachelor's degree in watershed science, 2 master's degrees, and is wrapping up his PhD. Daniel is undoubtedly a specialist on water issues, but where he truly stands to me as an environmental leader is the impact he makes beyond his research. Daniel is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, the project coordinator for Colorado Water Center's Water Fellow programs, and a member of the Climate Equity Committee in Fort Collins, Colorado. Daniel has also recently been appointed to the board of Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, an organization focused on restoring and stewarding the wildlands of Colorado. Daniel and I first met at the Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland in 2021. With his background and dedication to addressing climate issues, I knew Daniel was the ideal researcher to discuss how climate change is disrupting the global water cycle, and more importantly, what we can do to address the resulting water crisis. Before we get into the conversation, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. I also want to ask you to please hit the subscribe button. As a new independent podcast, your support helps bring insightful discussions to a global audience. Subscribing to the Climate Fairplay podcast ensures you won't miss any of our upcoming episodes and is the easiest way to help grow this platform. Thank you for listening. Now let's get into the conversation. Daniel, welcome to the Climate Fairplay podcast.
Hi, Cody. It's good to see you again, friend.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Daniel, I want to ask, where are you recording from?
I'm recording from my home in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Yeah, I have the lovely fortune of recording from my makeshift home studio, which one also might call a closet, here in Denver, Colorado. So I'm really thankful to have you on the podcast. The water cycle, as I highlighted in that introduction, is experiencing an unprecedented threat due to climate change, destructive land use, and overall mismanagement. Can you explain, number one, how the water cycle functions, and elaborate how these factors like climate change and destructive land use are disrupting it?
Yeah, so I think we can talk about it in like some simple steps, right? So we start at the ocean with the water evaporating into the atmosphere. That gets transported through atmospheric rivers, right? And so like the way I started thinking of it from there is precipitation here in Colorado, right? So most of our water in Colorado gets stored up in the Rockies as snowpack in the winters, and then that melts into the local watershed, which for me would be the Poudre River watershed, right? And then from there, it flows down into our cities in late spring, early summer. From there, it gets fed into our crops, our cities, any other use that is applied industry. And then from there, the Colorado River at least flows all the way back down to California, where I grew up. And along that route gets used and reused many times. And from there kind of returns back into the ocean. But the system itself is getting disrupted by climate change as a whole. So if we start with like how the snow falls, right? We're expected to experience more droughts, and we're expected to experience the snow melting faster, right? So our systems are built to kind of capture the snow in a low intensity, but with like warmer days and less snow falling in certain areas. Then we need to be able to capture that rapid melt or more efficiently so that we can distribute it when we need it to be distributed. As more intense fires have been appearing due to the management of our no fire policies here in the United States, wildfires are just getting more intense, and with that the soil and the ecosystem is disrupted, right? So as the snow is melting, it's no longer being captured by the trees and the understories up in the watershed, so the water tends to like shear off faster, and so that leads to more energy in the river, which leads to more erosion, which leads to more water quality impacts, either from the fire or just from our other human inputs. And from there, we also are expected to have more drought. So cities are, buying older water rights, which tend to be on farms. And, we're seeing this switch from agriculture runoff to cities storing it in reservoirs. The Glade Reservoir and then the Northern Integrated Supply Project have both been somewhat controversial here in Fort Collins. And I probably won't touch on them, but, I would highly recommend people go read up on that. But again, like cities are buying up water from agriculture, and I see it as a whole system, right? So we can't just take away water from our food sources. And I think there's bigger discussions about how our agriculture systems are built and how we're using our food systems. But as far as this is like, how do we get water to the people or the places that need it at certain times of the year? And then, as the water keeps falling down, like one of the other big issues is Lake Powell is drying up. The lower Colorado basin has been using more than their allotted share in the last couple of, well, not the last couple of years, for a long time, have been overusing their water allocation. And so, the federal system had to step in, and as Lake Powell was approaching the levels where it can no longer sustain electricity production, the federal government had to step in and kind of be like, what are we going to do here, because the system cannot function as it is right now. So I think those are more conversations that are going to become more prevalent in the future. And I think for me, I think one thing is that we all need to collaborate. It's not going to be who has water, who doesn't have water. We need to start thinking about a system where we're allocating and sharing the water in fair ways so that everyone can live and sustain themselves.
Yeah, as you said, we need to start thinking about how these communities and resources are shared because it's impacting everywhere. One of the things that's recently happened that we haven't talked about yet, Daniel, is the flooding in Asheville, North Carolina. 130 people died, and it's estimated to cost North Carolina $53 billion. At the same time we are seeing flooding events, we're having the opposite problem. Lake Mead is at 37% capacity, and we're facing water cutbacks all throughout the western United States. To summarize again, the recent State of Global Water Resources report has highlighted some alarming trends, such as below normal river flow, unprecedented glacier mass loss, releasing over 600 gigatons of water in a single year, and the projection that more than 5 billion people will face inadequate access to water by 2050. It also emphasizes the urgent need for improved monitoring, data sharing, and early warning systems. I guess, Daniel, it seems this is the type of research that you are specializing in right now. From your point of view, where do these tools become important in terms of the global water crisis?
Yeah, so I'm actually taking a climate forecasting class right now. And as part of it, we were talking about hurricane forecasting, just as was it Hurricane Ian that hit North Carolina?
There's so many names.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the hurricane that hit North Carolina, I was like actually sitting in class with, people that are building models to predict these hurricanes, and they talk about like the challenges that they're facing in data, and early forecasting has improved for a lot of hurricanes, but as we saw, we still really don't know what the hurricane is going to do and where it's going to hit. And again, like edge cases where, it didn't directly hit Asheville, North Carolina, but a lot of the precipitation ended up falling there. And, they weren't prepared because we didn't have this kind of forecasting thing. So
yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of issues are going to become more prevalent, and I think the US as a whole needs to start investing more on data and sensors. How can we build these data sets for scientists to be able to build these models that are necessary and better forecast how hurricanes are going to hit the US coast? And especially as we see the oceans warming, hurricanes are just going to become more prevalent. And I think we've been seeing that this hurricane season. And, I don't want to be an alarmist, but, it's only a matter of time before hurricanes start doing more things that are going to be an issue for us because we don't expect them to be there. And so we, just need to be able to build the necessary networks to better model and better predict these things before people really start getting hurt.
Yeah, and I guess going beyond the severe events that drive the news cycle, a part of the report found that more than 5 billion people will face inadequate access to water by 2050. Is there anything that we can do to help ensure access to clean water for people?
Yeah, I think that, as a society, we tend to be like, this is the one thing that's going to fix our system and, let us continue living the way we're living. But I think we as a society need to talk about what decisions we've made and kind of think about if we want to keep living that way. And it's not just one decision that's gonna save the Lake Powell Dam and energy efficiency, but the way that our society is structured, it's hard for someone to live sustainably, right? People need to get up, drop their kids off, drive to work, spend the day at work, come back. And even as we saw during COVID, that people can and should maybe be working from home, right? And that allows them a little bit more flexibility and time with their families. I know that there's like other concerns about like infrastructure in Denver not getting used and people not going to work in places that have historically been work centers like downtown, and those places being used as office space versus maybe repurposing them for homes. And I just think that we need to think about like some of these decisions, like why can't people work from home? Why are people being forced back into the offices when we know that they can be productive at home? And that doesn't just affect their work life, but also it affects the world. And then you're not commuting to and from work, then you can save on those carbon emissions. And if we have more reliable public transport, then kids don't need to be dropped off by their parents. We can kind of bus them to and from with sustainable transport. And similarly, we've always heard about rail from Fort Collins all the way down to Pueblo along the I-25 corridor. I think being able to have these bigger discussions and kind of start making decisions as a society of we want these things, we want to shift to those things, are what needed for people to get better access to sustainable resources. And there's still places like tribal nations that don't have water infrastructure, and I think part of that is that we don't want to give them that water. Yeah. And I think they're part of our country. They were here, they have their water rights, and we need to be able to give them the necessary water resources for them to access so that they can also have clean water.
I wanted to take a moment and discuss a little bit more the work you do as a water scientist and researcher. In your introduction, we mentioned how a couple of your projects that you're involved with are focused on equity and climate. What led you to realize you wanted to focus your career on this subject?
So I think from the very beginning, when I switched to water science after I left the Marine Corps, I think my ultimate goal was to kind of guide water policy in a national scale from science-based facts. And I think that the climate equity work is I'm starting to align my work a little bit more with it, but I still have a ways to go. My research itself focuses on augmenting the data that we have available through the use of AI. And so what I'm doing is predicting in situ water quality measurements. And I do that by pairing a water observation that was taken directly from a water body, like a river or a lake, and pairing that with a satellite image. And then I pair those two together, and then I input them into a AI algorithm that learns to predict the value of what's sitting in the water from photo values. And then that lets us kind of leverage the historic Landsat images that we have going all the way back to 1987, and allows us to zoom back out and then kind of look at national trends that have been going on across the US. Currently, I'm working on predicting dissolved organic carbon, but I'm hoping that my algorithms can be applied to different water quality parameters.
So you're using this data on a large scale, but I know a lot of the projects that you're involved with are on a community level. Can you explain how these connect into your career goals and how you're using water data to benefit people on a local level?
Yeah, so I would say that although my research does focus on the large scales, I am an action-oriented person. And so I also feel the need to kind of tithe my work into a smaller community and action-oriented stuff. So I recently got appointed to the City of Fort Collins Climate Equity Committee. And I pursued this mostly because back in January, my family back in San Diego went through a flood, which flooded our local community called Shelltown. It's a small barrio in southeastern San Diego. And that just kind of made me realize that communities that have been vulnerable in the past are just going to keep being more vulnerable as climate change effects continue to become more evident in our daily lives. And so, this was a flood that wasn't really predicted in the lifespan of our lives really, but again, through like local changes in precipitation regimes, I think that kind of exacerbated some of these issues. And, again, kind of exacerbated also by the fact that this is historically underserved community in San Diego, and it's mostly made up of immigrants and the children of immigrants. And I think that these kind of communities are spread out throughout our entire country. And so I know even in my own backyard here in Fort Collins, even though we like to think of Fort Collins as this mostly white place, there is a lot of people of similar backgrounds to me that work here and live here. And I think that they tend to be the people that are forgotten about the most in climate equity issues. And as when I saw the position open up at the city, I thought that this was a great place for me to act. Since I couldn't really help my family back in San Diego, I think that at least I could help reform the processes here in the city of Fort Collins to kind of keep those people in mind so that they're not as exposed to climate equity issues as they can be.
So, from your perspective, how can environmental research collaborate with community efforts to drive solutions to ensure sustainable water systems?
Yeah, I think that kind of brings back to my work with wildlands restoration volunteers. So recently, over the summer, I was working on building beaver dam analogs. And so we did this through a combined effort of fire mitigation. So we were removing material in forests where the tree canopy was very dense. And so by removing some of that dense material, in hopes that when a fire does go through there, it doesn't burn as hot, but also using that material sustainably. So building beaver dam analogs, which actually was really cool. We built some beaver dams in stretches of river that were downstream of a beaver dam, like actual beavers living on the river. And just from one week to the next week, we saw evidence of beavers returning downstream and exploring and hopefully fixing some of our beaver habitat so that they can move downstream and restore the riparian corridor naturally. And, I think that comes back to this. We want to manage things as humans because we can control them, but I think we need to start thinking about how we can incorporate nature. And in some places, beavers are still seen as nuisances because they build in floodplains. And a lot of our roads are actually in floodplains. And so beaver dams tend to get removed because it'll cause flooding on the road. I think, again, we need to start thinking about how we can work with nature to better manage our natural spaces. And I think doing these paired projects where we're doing fire mitigation to better control fires and then using that material in a sustainable manner and incorporating other things like controlled burns so that we can go in there in a controlled way and before a mega fire spreads through places, kind of manage that and have buy-in from communities that are going to be affected by that, telling them about why we need to do certain things. And no one wants fire in their backyard, but again, that's kind of what has led to a lot of this is our no fire policy. And so that can also tie to Native American and their science and how they manage the lands and having that indigenous knowledge to kind of incorporate it as well into our processes moving forward. And, again, big collaboration between all these entities to really restore and steward our lands.
If you care about preserving Colorado's raw beauty while providing access to nature, please consider supporting Wildland Restoration Volunteers. They're a local nonprofit working hard to restore and protect our state's wildlands through community-driven projects. Your donation helps fund essential conservation efforts, from trail maintenance to habitat restoration. Every contribution makes a difference. You can support Colorado's Wildland Restoration Volunteers by making a donation today at coloradogivescom/donate/WRV. You can find this link in the show notes, and thanks for helping preserve Colorado. The water cycle, it's experiencing unprecedented changes. There's reports and research about how we are facing more severe droughts and more intense flooding because of things like erosion and more intense energy flows in these waterways, like we've talked about. You've also talked about some of the pathways that you see we can move forward to gain better monitoring systems and data for managing freshwater resources. I guess I want to ask, Daniel, do you have any signs of hope or anywhere that you are inspired by when it comes to the current situation with our freshwater resources?
Yeah, like I think my favorite saying is collaboration, not conflict. I've been saying it a lot recently. And I think that kind of goes back to my work with the Water Fellows program. So I am a Water Fellow alumni. I was a Water Fellow at Colorado State University and the Colorado Water Center when I was an undergrad. And this was a program built on bringing people from underrepresented backgrounds in water issues to the table. And so one of the unique things is that it incorporates people from all different backgrounds in academia. So my year, I had me in like the hard sciences, but we also had an anthropologist and someone in fashion and design who wanted to explore sustainable water textile. So it made me really think about the way that water is used in different ways and how water relates to people in different ways. So being able to come back and work on the Water Fellows program as a project coordinator has been great. I've gotten to be the facilitator for 45 students now, and or 50 students now, and I love it. And just yesterday I was talking to some of my Water Fellows, and I think in most people's day they wouldn't talk to people who are interested in water from an engineering perspective, from a landscape management perspective, and from a biomedical science perspective. And so I think bringing these people together, and even as recently as 2 weeks ago when we had our field trip with the city of Fort Collins, you know, after everyone introduced themselves, the city people were like, wow, what a great, compassionate group of people interested in water. I think, again, collaboration is the way that we're going to move forward. And I think part of that is also bringing, again, the people from voices that we haven't heard from before to the table. And I think people think that me and maybe some of the Water Fellows are naive and some of the things that we might want to do. And I think that's okay. I think people have been like, you're definitely a dreamer. And I think that's okay. You know, like, do I think realistically that we're going to change the way that water is managed across the entire Western US? No. But do I think that we can incorporate things from perspectives that we haven't heard from before? Yes. And some of that is like personhood of rivers. I wouldn't say I've gotten in trouble for using certain phrases, but one of my comments in one of my past dissertations was you shouldn't use the word starve when you're talking about a river. But, you know, that's how I think of things. We are starving rivers by damming them up, and they have huge effects on the environment. And I think that's a little bit more prevalent. That way of thinking is a little bit more prevalent in indigenous sciences. And I think that's not something that we think about a lot in the way that our current water system is implemented. And I think we've gotten a little bit better. We have like in-stream water rights now, but what would it look like if we say that streams should have a right to have water in them across their whole stretch, right? And so I think that's the kind of thing that we can discuss. How can we take something from that into our system and incorporate it?
I'm very inspired by the new wave of environmental thought that's sort of taking over these traditional rigid ways that we are supposed to communicate about the environment with people, just because I don't think it does a very effective job of actually getting the message across of what's actually happening. And then it limits the conversation to a very small select people who understand the very complex jargon and intricacies of what the research is talking about. So I think that's really cool, Daniel. I guess what's motivating you to foster this community, and what impact do you hope it will have even further, maybe with the water and climate issues?
Yeah, I think one, exposing people to different backgrounds in water is great, right? So we have 21 water fellows this year, and we have 19 majors covered in them, which I think is super unique. And I think everyone I tell that to always has this, whoa, like how? Right? And it just comes from people wanting to do interdisciplinary research in science, and them realizing that water isn't this standalone thing to them, and it does have implications for them, for how humans manage it and how it's applied across our systems. And I think that's what really motivates me, and also how I see change actually happening, right? As like a single person, I can only do so much, I can only change so much or have an effect in so many ways. But again, I think these are the future water leaders across the board, right? And so by preparing them and engaging them early in their career and having them think about these things, one day in the future they're going to be in positions of power where they can question and collaborate across different agencies and be like, you know what, that's how we've done things in the past, but is that how we should do that moving forward? And again, I think of this as not just what we can do in the present, but again, like planting those seeds for the future and building these networks of, again, caring people that want to collaborate and want to move forward together.
Yeah. So Fort Collins, it's a great area to understand environmental science and to relate this on a community level. I want to briefly tell my own background. I wasn't actually aware of the career paths in these sciences until I was living in Fort Collins, and I was surrounded by people who were pursuing really amazing research all around the world, and I was inspired to go along the same path. Daniel, did you grow up in Shelltown?
Yes, so I grew up in Shelltown. I went to school right in our neighborhood, Balboa Elementary. Yeah, it's so funny because I actually didn't speak English until I started pre-K. And I remember even outside of like class, I would like, me and my friends would only speak in Spanish, and that kind of was the way that we lived all the way up until high school. When we weren't directly in class, we were always speaking Spanish. And I always kind of saw that as my native language, I guess, even though I was living here in the United States. Because even when I went to the store, when I went to do any business transactions, it was always like in Spanish. And then I actually, English didn't become my like primary language until I joined the Marine Corps. Yeah, and so then from then on, I started speaking mostly English, and yeah, it's been an interesting time.
So I said how I found my path towards environmental science and knew it was a career path for me. Like, what led you to this path, and what do you think would lead to more people to go down this sort of career field?
It's actually kind of funny because even though I grew up right next to the beach, I never actually used to go to the beach. And whenever I mentioned I'm from San Diego, people were like, "Oh, you must be a surfer." And I was like, "No, I grew up in like the inner city." And we don't really, yeah, my family didn't really have the resources, I guess, to like, pick up like the hobbies that are pervasive with like Colorado culture, at least in the eyes of the public. And then I actually didn't really start even forming a connection with nature until I joined the Marine Corps when they like forced me to hike around with a 60-pound pack around the foothills of Pendleton. And at first I was like, I never want to do this again. But then and then like slowly on the weekends, I would like start going on hikes and like being like, this isn't so bad when you can go at your own pace and, go hiking where you want to go hiking. And yeah, ever since then, it's kind of been like this escape for me of being able to find like peace in nature and like not think about all the things that are going on in my life or society at the moment. And yeah, like to this day, I look for any opportunity to go up to the mountains. And that's actually how I got connected with wildlands restoration volunteers. I just was looking for ways to like go up to the mountains, and it actually kind of seemed like kind of ideal for me because I also grew up like doing a lot of manual labor. And so with my now a job as a computer scientist in the hydrologic field, I don't actually get to do a lot of like physical labor. So, I mostly do like workouts and stuff here and there, but on as many weekends as I can, I go out with WRV and I do different volunteering projects where I'm either breaking rocks in smaller rocks, digging pits for, like implementing that on the soil on a trail. Or I also got my chainsaw my sawyer certification through the U.S. Forest Service. So actually I'm a volunteer sawyer for them. So just even past weekend, I was out just south of here in Loveland, Colorado, removing Russian olive, which is a really intense, noxious weed that the USDA classifies as like something that needs to get like removed and treated in specific ways. So I didn't know this, but you need to like cut the stump of a Russian olive and then like apply herbicide directly to it like within a minute or two, because otherwise the sap will blister and it'll just regrow even thicker.
If you care about preserving Colorado's raw beauty while providing access to nature, please consider supporting wildland restoration volunteers. They're a local nonprofit working hard to restore and protect our state's wildlands through community-driven projects. Your donation helps fund essential conservation efforts, from trail maintenance to habitat restoration. Every contribution makes a difference. You can support Colorado's wildland restoration volunteers by making a donation today at coloradogives.org/donate/WRV. You can find this link in the show notes, and thanks for helping preserve Colorado.
Yeah. So for our listeners who are inspired by your work, how can they apply the principles and practices that you instill in the Water Fellows to their own lives or communities, even if they're not directly involved in water science?
Yeah, I think that's also a societal thing is, we tend to want to be one thing or like tell people that they can only be one thing. And I think there's just this, even to me, there's just so many things that I'm obviously interested in, right? I have like 4 jobs. And I think any sane person would be like, that's a lot of jobs and a lot of work. But I was like, you know what? Realistically, I'm only going to code so much in a day, right? And so I think I always hear that people wish that they could have someone like me on their jobs, right? And so I think a lot of that is me, willing to, I pay my own salary right now through my fellowship. So part of me is like, what would it look like if I could give my skills to a different organization that could use that in a different way, right? And so again, it's not just, oh, I'm sitting in my office every day coding. I did that for a year and it did not work out very well for me. So being able to take time off and go learn from people who are applying hydrology in different ways. I've learned so much from different people that do applied hydrology and learning about drainage in trails and how different systems are used to get water off a trail. And again, these different ways of applying hydrology and being like, is engineering really the way we want to go? Can't we just, kind of restore it and then again, let nature's engineers take it from there with, letting a beaver do its thing and seeing how the riparian corridor repairs and seeing how that provides better fish habitat, better habitat for the insects that live in there and how it affects water quality. But yeah, I think I feel like if I was only a water scientist, yes, I would be an effective person. But again, I think just recently I've heard from one of my fellow committee members on the Climate Equity Committee who was like, oh, I'm a free range human. When I'm here, you're engaging with this part of me, but I'm a whole person, right? And so like there's multitudes to everyone. And so I don't think you need to be a water scientist to really be engaged in water, right? Just learning where your water comes from and what's going on with your water and your watershed and how it's managed, and you being like, oh, well, that's learning something about your water system and then going in and being like, I'm not okay with some of the things that are being done here. Who do I talk to? Who can I engage with? And just being a better water steward, I would say. It doesn't have to be your whole life, but when you go for a hike, or if you're not hiking, go for a hike and be like, oh, this is where my water originates, and learning about that system, learning about how that system is managed, and just getting in touch with the water around you.
Yeah. Daniel, it really seems from my perspective that your knowledge of water and your studying is only a piece of what's making you a water leader. It's how you're emphasizing that in your community and showing up for your community is really what's making you a leader. and everybody can do that in their own right. I guess as we wrap up our conversation, are there any final thoughts or insights you'd like to share that we haven't touched on yet?
I would say that, everything touches water, right? And so there's always some way to get engaged with water. And I think that's what it kind of like brings out the water fellows again in a unique perspective, right? Like, it touches every aspect of our lives, no matter what we're in, right? Whether you're just living in your home and your tap water doesn't turn on one day, or you're in fashion and you want to explore more efficient water textiles, or if you're a computer scientist like me, like all of that gets made using water. And so we need to think about like the resources that we use, and if we actually want to use them in those ways. One exercise you could do just at home is think, just pick an item and think about what went into making that, right? So I'm talking from my dinner table at the moment and just thinking about where the wood came from, how the tree grew using water, how the tree was cut down and transported, how it was processed using water, how it was put together using water, and then transported to where I bought it from, and then how it's sitting here now. Water, no matter what we're using or doing, is connected in some way. And I think that's just kind of the point that I want to drive home.
Yeah, it really is. Daniel, if people want to learn more about your work or get involved to help, where can they find more information? Are there any resources, events, or platforms you'd recommend, whether they're in Colorado or connecting online?
I would say that look up the Colorado Water Center to start off with, and the Water Fellows program. We just expanded to more universities. So now we're not only at Colorado State University, we're also at MSU Denver, Colorado Mesa University, the University of Colorado Boulder, and DU Law. And I think any of those programs you can look up. Each one of them is unique and incorporates different knowledge bases. Yeah, I think the Water Fellows program is a great way to get engaged and just look at what everyone's doing across the state of Colorado. And again, building this collaborative network of future leaders in the water sector. But apart from that, I would just say, yeah, like look up where your water comes from. If you're not here in Colorado, like, did the water come from the mountains? Did it originate here in the mountains of Colorado, or did it come from somewhere else? And start there. And again, it doesn't have to be like your whole life, right? But if you're interested in water and the future issues that we're going to face, I think it's a good place to start.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. Thanks for having me. It was great seeing you again. We'll have to catch up again soon.
As we wrap up, what are the key takeaways from our discussion? There's real power in getting involved and taking action, like Daniel has in his community. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Climate Fairplay podcast. I'd love for you to join in on the conversation on places like Instagram, Reddit, and Threads. You can find the podcast by looking up Climate Fairplay. Before we go, I do have one quick request. Please hit the subscribe button. It's the easiest way to support the podcast and to stay updated on the latest episodes. Thanks again for listening to the Climate Fairplay.